So we'll now hear from Colonel Dale. You have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll ask him to begin. Colonel.
Hello, my name is Colonel Jack Dale. I'm with the Broward Sheriff's Office. I'm in charge of both professional standards and the Department of Investigations. As our agency has continued to investigate this, we have a strong desire to learn from the tragedy, and we welcome all the input of the eventual report. And in doing so, our intention is to operate in complete transparency and give you everything that we possibly can to help you make an informed decision. We still have an ongoing criminal investigative effort. A number of statements still have to be taken. So these will be the best facts as we know them now. They could be subject to change. We do have times that are listed. Those times are based on the clock that is part of the source of information. So not necessarily one clock will be synced with another clock, so there could be off by seconds in each of these different sources. The investigative effort, as the sheriff alluded to earlier, has been massive. Following the events of February 14th, in the following days, we had to process a 3-story building and interview and make contact with literally thousands of witnesses, meaning virtually every student in the school, to determine who the witnesses were. We received a high level of cooperation from the FBI, Coral Springs Police Department, and surrounding agencies that responded to the event. As we continue in the criminal investigation, there is also an ongoing effort for us to try and analyze and see what we can learn immediately, and that's how we compiled some of the information that we're sharing today. In addition to the House Committee, we also have a governor's investigation with FDLE, which we are cooperating with. The county has contracted a consultant, so I'm a part of that task force. We've also enlisted the Police Executive Forum to do a lesson learned that will occur after these 2 reviews. FBI Behavioral Science Unit has reached out to us in an event to also analyze the event. And we certainly, after we compile all the findings, will be giving presentations to other law enforcement agencies so they too can learn from this incident. I'd like to start by, for those not familiar with Stoneman Douglas, is to kind of give some area facts and set the stage here. It's located in the city of Parkland. The population is approximately 37,000. Staffing for Parkland on a typical day is a sergeant and 4 deputies, plus any detectives or supervisor on scene or other school resource officers throughout the town. It's attended by approximately 3,200 students, 200 staff. It's a 45-acre campus with 13 buildings. There's 1 full-time school resource deputy, and district deputies typically assist with traffic details at both the opening of school in the morning and during dismissal. School has several unarmed security specialists on campus, and the video system within the school covers 70 different camera angles. A vast majority of the camera angles are of exterior views that point internal to the classroom areas. Nearly all the classrooms are accessed from an outside door, with the exception of Building 12. Building 12 is where the shooting happened. You'll hear it referred to as the 1200 building and the freshman building. It's a 3-story building with stairwells on the east and west. The suspect, 19 years of age, was charged with 17 counts of homicide and 17 counts of attempted homicide. He's a former MSD student. He's been medically evaluated several times by school and Henderson behavioral health personnel. In each of those situations, the criteria for an involuntary psychological evaluation, meaning in Florida Baker Act, was not met, and he received no involuntary incarceration, detained in evaluation. He has no prior arrest. He received counseling from the school. That school counseling was discontinued once he reached the age of 18. Apparently, once you become an adult, you are able to decline those services. He has no juvenile civil citations that were issued through any law enforcement entity that we found. The school board reports that there was no promise program participation. We have documents that we will be sharing, but to our knowledge at this point, we do not know of any promise program participation. All of his weapons were purchased legally. He was armed with an AR-15 and more than 300 rounds of ammunition. His prior law enforcement contact. There are 49 BSO calls for service, either involving Nicholas Cruz or his address. When we look at those calls for service closer, we find that 18 of them directly involve Nicholas Cruz. A large number of the other cases involve maybe his brother or another issue that the mother has called for law enforcement services. Of the 18, they range for a variety of instances, some as benign as Cruz being stopped for riding his bicycle at night without a light on it, to family disturbances where the mother is called, she's having difficulty parenting her child. In one case, she took away his Xbox and he wasn't listening and locked himself in a room. There are no prior calls that would constitute a prosecutable criminal offense. There were no situations where a deputy would have had the ability or probable cause to make an arrest. 2 of the prior calls are being investigated internally, so they're an internal affairs investigation, and to the public, those facts are not able to be disclosed. They deal primarily with the efforts to document 2 of those prior calls and to determine whether the deputies in those instances documented what was reported to them properly. There were also BSO or FBI tips and Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office calls for service that we're receiving the information from those as well. In Parkland, the police and fire services are split. Parkland contracts the Broward Sheriff's Office to provide its law enforcement services, and Coral Springs Fire Department is contracted for its fire EMS services. BSO has approximately 5,600 employees. In the Department of Law Enforcement, we refer to as DLE, there are approximately 1,500 deputies over 16 districts to include the airport, seaport, and courthouse. In Department of Detention, we have approximately 1,300 deputies, 3 facilities. And in fire, 700 firefighter paramedics. We have a regional communications, 450 personnel. It's countywide for the past 4 years, and with 2 municipal agencies that have opted out and continue to run their own communication centers, and that would be Coral Springs and Plantation. We also have Children Protective Investigative Services contracted us by the state of 150 personnel, and we run the county's crime lab, service all the county agencies for all its laboratory services. We're having a little slide problem here. In a typical 911 routing, what's missing from the photo, is the typical call comes in by either a landline or a cellular phone. It goes to 911 in the center of the slide. They're met by a call taker. The call taker interviews the caller, passes the information on to a dispatcher who either puts it out to the law enforcement side of the house or the fire side of the house, or both if it calls for both. In Parkland, it's a little different. We have a very unique situation where the law enforcement, while it's not unique to have separate agencies providing law enforcement and fire services, what is unique is that there are 2 different communication centers used. And the way that it's split up for Parkland, a decision made some time ago, to have landline 911 calls go to the regional communication center, which would be BSO, and all cellular communications go to the Coral Springs Communication Center. So approximately 80% of the calls that a 911 center receives today come in by cellular callers. So in this case, what happens is if it comes in by landline, you look at the top of the flow chart, it comes into 911, the call taker filters the call. If it's fire EMS on the BSO side, so if it comes in landline it goes to the call taker. If it's a fire EMS call, it gets transferred over to Coral Springs. If Coral Springs takes a cellular call, that should be a police call, it gets transferred over to BSO. So that way, it's an extra step, but it will occur in order to make sure that the proper entity receives that call and can respond. So during the event from 2:22 p.m. to 3:35 p.m., we just use those times surrounding the event. The 911 landline calls are routed to BSO. BSO receives approximately 71 incoming calls during this time. No calls were abandoned, that meaning that they were all answered. Every call that came in was picked up by an operator and there was contact made. It could mean that the person, if a call was abandoned, it could mean the person either the call was dropped, it rang for a certain amount of time, and they hung up. We have a large number of trunks being a regional system, and there were no calls that received a busy signal. There was only one inbound call that was received from the school. All the other calls were either second or third hand callers, meaning that maybe a parent had received a text of the shooting at the school, and they were calling because they were concerned about what was happening at Stoneman Douglas, but they had little, if any, direct information regarding what was happening at the school that would be considered real time. The remaining 70 calls, they've said all second and third hand. The one that was inbound was a voice over internet. It was a male whispering, and then he disconnected. On the Coral Springs side, they received the cell phones. They're routed to their system. They received approximately 86 calls. This is an estimate from the data they provided to us. Callers abandoned 21 of these calls, meaning that they rang or were disconnected before they could be answered. And a busy signal was received, according to AT&T, by one of these calls at 2:27 p.m., meaning that their trunks had filled and it had reached the capacity of their system. The 3 calls of the 86 were transferred or relayed from Coral Springs to BSO. In the initial calls, the actual caller themselves was not transferred. It was simply what information was learned by the call taker, and it was shared with the Broward call taker. And the information can best be summarized in the 4 bullet points. First was the initial call of shots fired at Stoneman Douglas, that they could actually hear shots fired over the callers. Someone was shot in the 1200 building, then a shooter in the North student parking lot, and later on, much later into the event, third-hand information that the shooter was wearing a vest. That was the what was gleaned essentially from the calls that came into Coral Springs. Campus map is displayed here. You can see outlined is the Stoneman Douglas campus, and to the west, West Glades Middle School. The football fields will come up, as well as Building 12, which is highlighted in red. I'll now walk you through an incident timeline to put some of that in perspective with the things that are happening outside the building. You'll see there are 2 columns. The column on the left is the information that is provided to deputies that are out on the scene and through their transmissions. The items on the right, if they're from another source, they're in white to give you some time reference. If they're in blue, they're on a separate channel for Coral Springs Police. In the case of the 2 communications systems, the Coral Springs radio channels are inaccessible to Broward Sheriff's Office, and were advised that they were unable to dial into our channel, which is you'll refer to as 8 Alpha. Normally in a regional system, we would just simply patch the 2 channels so that everyone would come together and they would be sharing common information. However, for the duration of the incident, the response from Coral Springs and BSO must operate on 2 different channels, and attempts to patch are unsuccessful. There is a request for Coral Springs to come onto a joint channel so that joint channel can be patched, but for whatever reason, it never happened. It was not successful. So what we do is we separate the two timelines so you can see what the information is of the first responders in Parkland. So at 2:19 is the time at which the Uber drops off the suspect at the school. And at 2:21 is when he enters the building 12 through the east entrance and makes his weapon ready. It's then at 2:21 that the school resource officer, Peterson, receives a call of possible firecrackers at building 12. Also at 2:21, the suspect begins shooting on the first floor. At 2:22 is when the 911 calls begin to come into Coral Springs via cell phones at the school. And the fire alarm is then activated. And of course, during the fire alarm, the students, it's the second fire alarm of the day. There was another one at around 10 o'clock, but the students begin to exit the classrooms. Suspect proceeds to the, at this point, the first floor shooting has already occurred. He proceeds to the second floor, and we have the school resource officer coming on to scene, and he is located on the east side of the building. He reports shots fired, and those shots fired appear to be timed with the last shots fired on the first floor when you see one of the victims opens the exterior door and in the stairwell. So we believe that those the opening of the door allowed those rounds to project outward and make it clearly audible to those outside the building. So Peterson arrives, and at the same time that he begins to transmit, there's the alert tone coming over the radio to let the units know of the active shooter based on the information received from Coral Springs. Peterson hears the alert tone and then immediately comes over and announces that there are possible firecrackers, possible shots fired at the 1200 building at MSD. He says, you know, quote, we're looking at the 1200 building at 2:25. The suspect is on the second floor and then proceeds fairly rapidly through the second floor. There are no victims there. We believe that of all the students that are there, they're sheltered in place. It appears that they can possibly hear the rounds on the floor below. The third floor, it seems there's enough of a buffer that they're responding to the fire drill. Suspect proceeds to the third floor at 2:24, and at 2:25, a Coral Springs officer comes on their channel, on a talk-around channel, and asks if there's a possible active shooter at Stoneman Douglas. It appears that he's run across a fire crew, and the fire crew is responding. They've exchanged this information, and the Coral Springs officers first learn from this sort of random exchange that it's occurring. The dispatcher confirms it. He then repeats it on the their main channel, and that's when the response from Coral Springs begins. At 2:25, the deputy reports I hear shots fired by the football field. Peterson says, okay, we're also looking at the 1200 building, and there are deputies to the west that believe that the shots are coming from the football field area. At 2:26 on the Coral Springs channel, they are told of the shooting there on their main channel, and that they can hear shots being fired through the phone, and that they think they're landline with a teacher. At 2:26, they advise of the active shooter and that their lines are quote unquote blowing up. At 2:26 on the BSO side, they hear shots fired, unable to determine a place of origin. At 2:27, deputies report more shots fired by the football field, and at 2:27, the suspect has now discarded the weapon and flees from the building. Also at 2:27, Peterson comes on the air and says, make sure no one comes in front of the school. On the Coral Springs side, the first Coral Springs officer arrives on scene. It's Officer Burton, in the arm of the rifle, comes onto the south side of the campus and proceeds, walks from the south toward the 1200 building. He's met by a security personnel, and receives a description of the suspect that he puts out on the radio. That description goes out at 2:28 on their channel only. At 2:27, Peterson is make sure no one comes close to the front of the school. At 2:28, tells units to stay 500 feet from the 1200 building. Also at 2:28, a deputy advises that he has a gunshot victim located on the west end of the football field. Also at 2:28, there's a gunshot victim near the entrance of Westglade. On the BSO side at this point, the only victims that are known are at the football field, and we have shots fired at the football field in the area of the 1200 building. So the information at this point is there are no indications to deputies that there are victims that are within the 1200 building. At 2:29, deputies advise they do not know where the shooter is, and they attempt entry into building 13. Also at 2:29, over the Coral Springs channel, they advise of 3 victims down in room 1216. This is the first transmission over a channel to law enforcement where there's actually a pinpointed location within 1200. There are further CAD records that show additional calls that are also coming in on the Coral Springs side related to victims in the 1200 building. At 2:30, Coral Springs officers moving with 2 BSO deputies advise that they see a victim down outside the 1200 building. They do not know where the suspect location is at that point. At 2:30, the captain asks if a perimeter has been set, if the kids are being cleared out of the school. Coral Springs requests on their channel traffic to be blocked. School lets out at 2:40. There's a large number of parents coming into the area at the same time, and there are students leaving the campus from the fire alarm activity. At 2:31, the first arriving Coral Springs officer is on the east side of the 1200 building and becomes in contact with Peterson. At 2:32, BSO and the group make entry into building 12 through the west entrance, and they begin to extricate victims. Also at 2:32, dispatch again advises the gunshot victims in room 1216. On the Coral Springs side, they have officer reports gunshots going in or out of a 3rd floor window, and there are bullet holes in that west side window. At 2:33, a BSO team advises they make entry into building 9. At 2:34, the captain establishes a command post. At 2:35, the first victim is taken by golf cart out to EMS by Coral Springs and BSO. And at 2:35 on the Coral Springs channel, they advise there are plenty of officers in the 1200 building starting to move up floors. We do not have an active scene, is what they report. Meanwhile, there are attempts by deputies and officers to pair up with security personnel and to start, they're basically standing together with their radios out trying to relay information to one another. And shortly thereafter, we start to see the first effects of radio failure, what we call throttling or fail-safe mode. At 2:36, additional Coral Springs and BSO personnel enter building 12. At 2:40, K-9 is on scene as part of an apprehension effort. At 2:40, officers begin clearing the 2nd floor of building 12. At 2:41, deputies report having radio transmission problems. When we term throttling or fail-safe, these happen when a certain number of users basically overload the system, meaning that so many people turn on that the system starts to have a failure. We experienced the same thing in the Fort Lauderdale airport shooting, and the radio system, the current radio system, is end of life, and the county, we're told, they maintain the infrastructure and that they plan to replace the system in 2019. The results are that people are attempting to transmit and they can't gain the channel and they can't put information over. And it's witnessed by body camera footage where we see deputies paired up with officers and security personnel attempting to relay information over their independent channels, and they're attempting to key up, and it's taking them 4 or 5 attempts at transmission before they can get across a single piece of information. At 2:44, the first bolo comes out over a BSO channel for the suspect with his description. At 2:44, Coral Springs advises that they have a patch, but it's unsuccessful. At 2:44, the Coral Springs requests the perimeter as they're being flooded by parents. At 2:47, the patch is abandoned, and the throttling becomes more pronounced on the radio. Again, as more people dial into the channel, it exceeds the capabilities of the system. At 2:50, the suspect enters the Walmart. 2:52, he leaves the Walmart. And at 2:51, BSO SWAT enters Building 12. They were in training at Markham Park in Weston and responded directly up from Weston to the scene. At 3:02, officers and deputies began clearing the third floor. At the same time, the suspect leaves the McDonald's. At 3:02, dispatch advises of the suspect leaving westbound from the school. It's later determined that this is approximately 20-minute delay. It seems that security personnel attempting to identify who they believe the shooter is have rewound the footage. They can't see him on live footage, so they've gone back in time, and they're putting out a description of him, but unbeknownst to the officers and deputies that this is actually a delayed image that they're looking at. At 3:05, Coral Springs advised on their channel that the suspect ran west and south from the school. At 3:09, the identity is learned on the BSO side, and they put out his name. At 3:13, you see 4 minutes later, the Coral Springs channel puts out the identity of the suspect. At 3:16, Colonel assumes command of the incident, and he reports also the difficulty in transmitting due to radio problems. There are several times where the prior on-scene commander, Captain Jordan, is actually attempting to transmit on her radio. It's not working. She tries using someone else's radio. It's not working. She tried a car radio, and that wasn't working. So there are times in the tape where they're calling her, and she's attempting to transmit but can't reply. At 3:25, BSO detective relays a possible address for the suspect. We have detectives attempting to locate his home. We're speaking with the Cruz family, and we learned that he's possibly in the area of the McDonald's. By 3:33, officers and deputies continue to evacuate students and teachers in the other buildings. At 3:39, a suspect's detained, and at 3:40, he's confirmed to be in custody. That's all the information that I have.